Welcome to this session on decarbonising the Welsh economy, with a particular focus on carbon modelling and an even more particular focus on carbon modelling in the housing sector. I'll introduce our three speakers and then tell you how we're going from there. So to my right is Professor Darren Robinson, Professor of Architectural and Urban Sciences at the University of Sheffield. Darren is the author of a report on carbon modelling in the housing sector, which we published last week, together with my colleagues Helen, Jack and Amy, who's not here today. And Darren is one of the experts. When we looked around for expertise in this area, we thought the expert in developing carbon modelling models, as it were. And you'll tell us a bit more about it in a minute, but you can also read the policy brief and the report on our website. We did this piece of work because the Welsh Government asked us to look at ways of modelling carbon models, and we felt housing sector was a good area to pilot this in, so that's how we came about that piece of work. Jeroen van der Heijden is online. We can see him when it comes to his presentations. You can't see us, Jeroen, but we know that you're there, and welcome. Thanks for joining us today. Jeroen is Professor of Public Governance and the inaugural Chair in Regulatory Practice at the School of Government, Victoria University at Wellington. I was slightly alarmed when I read that a few days ago, but I'm reliably informed that you're not currently in New Zealand and therefore not talking to us in the middle of the night. You're somewhere on the European continent, which is reassuring. And Jeroen is joining us because he's been interested for many years in understanding how cities seek to increase their climate change resilience and sustainability, and has done quite a lot of international comparative research projects on urban climate governance with cities both from developed economies and low and middle income countries. So we're really pleased that you could join us today. And then thirdly, to my left, John Oates, who is currently Interim Deputy Director for Climate Change and Domestic Energy Efficiency in the Welsh Government, has very kindly agreed to give us a perspective, as it were, from the Welsh Government policy stance. John is also quite closely involved in the commission which Jane is chairing, which we've already heard a bit about today. So welcome to the three of you. Thank you very much. I'm excited to hear what you have to say. Darren, over to you first.
Okay, thank you. So, as you've heard, I was asked about a year ago to write an evidence review to give a perspective on the kinds of models that have been developed over the last 50 years or so to help get a handle on the emissions, the energy use and carbon emissions arising from housing, and how those models can be used to support the formulation of decarbonisation policy. So in this talk, it might be a little bit of a whirlwind, but I'll try to take you on a kind of guided visual tour through that report. I tend to speak quite quickly when I'm enthusiastic, so apologies in advance.
We'll worry if you slow down then in that case.
So give me a shout if I need to repeat anything. Okay. So, I'll start with, just a few statistics to kind of place the importance of this issue into some context. So there seems to be some variation according to the statistics that you look at, but there seems to be more or less consensus that around a quarter of CO2 emissions in the UK are due to the housing stock. The Welsh Government's decarbonisation strategy, Net Zero Wales, calls for a reduction in carbon emissions arising from Welsh buildings by 80% with respect to 1990 levels by 2050. Something that relates a little bit to some of the discussion that came up in the previous session is that it has been estimated recently that around 9 million people will be in fuel poverty come the end of April this year. There are different definitions of fuel poverty between Scotland and Wales and England. So there might be some variance to that figure, but it's still quite alarming. And it's estimated that over 11,000 winter deaths are due to cold homes. So we have, in my opinion, dual objectives. We have a humanitarian objective to bring people out of fuel poverty. And I think the first and obvious strategy for that is to upgrade the quality of the fabric of housing. And, you know, we have a societal kind of imperative to decarbonise. Well, the clicker's a bit hit and miss. Okay, so how have we got to where we are now? So over the last 30 years, not very much has changed in terms of energy use. So we've seen that there's been a growth on the whole in transport energy use. We've been exporting industrial activity, so industrial energy use or industry, energy use arising from industry has been reducing. The domestic sector has stayed fairly consistently at around 25% of carbon emissions and corresponding energy use. Of course, there was a little kind of dip in transport emissions due to COVID and the fact that we were all fairly severely constrained. But the fact of the matter is, over the last 30 years, not a whole lot has changed. We have seen that we've been investing in centralised gas heating systems. There has been some improvement in the fabric of existing buildings. Of course, there have been newly constructed buildings constructed to a higher standard. But on the whole, the energy use has remained fairly similar, and that's largely because indoor temperatures have risen, and it's estimated that they've risen by about 4 degrees Celsius since 1970. Obviously, that predates this chart, but we've been experiencing a fairly significant rebound effect. So whereas there's been a reduced demand, if you like, for expenditure on heating, that hasn't necessarily, well, there's been a reduced propensity for reduced amount of expenditure on heating, but that hasn't been realised because people have been benefiting from improved comfort levels in their homes. With respect to how the Welsh housing stock looks at the moment, then we see that the social rental sector is performing consistently, fairly considerably better than the owner-occupied sector or the private rental sector. So those figures are the energy efficiency scores from SAP calculations. In brackets here, we've got the proportion of that typology of house that meets EPC A to C, or EPC C rating or better. And similarly, we've got those same figures shown for the different sectors. So 56% of social rental housing achieves EPC C or better, and it's less than half that in the owner-occupied sector and almost half that in the private rental sector. So the social housing sector is massively outperforming the other sectors, but it represents a smaller proportion of the total stock of houses. Nevertheless, if you look at the target to achieve an EPC rating of A across the entire stock and the median 92 plus energy efficiency score that corresponds to, then we're falling, or Wales is falling currently a long way short. So in summary, there hasn't been a great deal of movement up to this point, and where we are now is a long way short of where we ought to be to achieve the 2050 decarbonisation objectives. So I'm biased, I'm a modeller. I've been doing modelling of energy use in houses and stocks of houses for about 25 years. So I think that they have a useful role to play so that we can test the effectiveness of alternative policy strategies and scenarios to decarbonise buildings in general. With respect to housing, then this diagram summarises the different strategies that have been put in place over the last 4 or 5 decades. So I'll just kind of cut to the chase. Most of the useful models are what we call bottom-up models, where we try to disaggregate the housing stock in terms of cohorts of age and different kind of typologies of form. So we're distinguishing between terraces, end terraces, semi-detached, detached, flats, etc., etc. So those are either statistical or engineering. So statistical is just relating things like fuel bills to the typology of a house and its age. the engineering are where we're trying to model the underlying physical processes that lead to a demand for heating, for hot water, for lights, electricity for appliances, and so on and so forth. So those are the most powerful because we're trying to model the underlying physical processes, which means that we can test quite specific strategies for decarbonising the houses. And they vary depending upon whether we're using what we call a simplified energy balance, that's a monthly calculation, or whether we're dynamically simulating hour by hour how much energy is used and what the indoor conditions are like as a result of that use of energy. And they vary also by the degree of kind of rigour, if you like, with which they represent the diversity of the stock of houses. So that's by their distributions of age, by the typologies of house, by the ways in which the walls were constructed, the kinds of windows that they have, etc., etc., etc. So in England, at least, then one of the most utilised models to support policy is called the Cambridge Housing Model. So that's one of these variants of a monthly energy balance model. To date, that's been used fairly intensively to support the kind of the backcasting, if you like, of how the stock performs now and how it has performed in the past. It has been used to a limited extent to understand to what extent carbon emissions and energy use would vary in response to specific interventions to specific types of property. This graph shows, again, it's with respect to 1970 levels up to 2012, in fact. It's the amount of space heating energy use. You can see that that's increased consistently, and it's also the share of how of the total energy use that is due to heating in houses. And you can see again that that's consistently been increasing as people have been kind of taking back the co-benefit of investments in their properties to improve their comfort in their homes and correspondingly improve health outcomes. In my group at Sheffield, we've been developing over the last, that's almost 10 years now, something that we call the UK Energy Hub, or EnHub for short. So that's a hourly dynamic energy simulation modelling platform where we can simulate the entire housing stock and how that housing stock uses energy hour by hour throughout the year. So because it's hourly, because we're modelling the underlying physical processes in an explicit way, we can predict the indoor temperature, we can predict the indoor humidity, we can predict, we can embed models of human behaviour, so we can model how people are going to, and under what circumstances, open windows and how that's going to feed back on indoor conditions, things like that. It's also, in contrast to many other models, open source, modular, so it's quite easy to update and easy to substitute alternative models and data sets as well. And in this context, I think that's interesting. So, so with that EnHub modelling platform, then here are a couple of histograms. So on the left, we've got the entire housing stock represented in two different cohorts of age. On the X, we've got the area, and on the Y, we've got energy use intensity in kilowatt hours per metre squared. So the area of each of those histograms represents the total energy use for each of those cohorts of age. And similarly, we've got a histogram where we've got different typologies of house, so semi-detached, terraced, etc., etc. And again, the area of each of those represents the total energy use. And of course, we could produce a similar graphic with respect to carbon emissions. In addition to that, we can also produce this kind of distribution, so how energy use and carbon emissions are distributed throughout those typologies, or indeed those cohorts of age. We can test different strategies, or scenarios rather, in terms of the reduction of energy use and corresponding carbon emissions. So here we've tested different scenarios regarding investments in solid wall insulation, the substitution of single glaze with double glaze windows, loft insulation, draft stripping, etc., etc. And we've tested two kinds of scenarios. So one is where we have perfect uptake amongst the entire housing stock that hasn't already employed that measure, or some potential uptake. And here we're just putting a finger in the air and we're saying, well, what if 60% of the candidate houses did take up that measure. So this is how it would play out in terms of the percentage reduction in carbon emissions across the entire stock of houses if those measures were taken up. And it's a little bit disappointing reading because the bottom line is that the effectiveness is quite limited. But these are just demand side interventions. We can of course also look at supply side interventions. So this is a similar kind of histogram to what I showed a minute ago, where we've got on the x-axis the total floor area of housing, and on the y-axis it's the energy use intensity for houses that employ those different types of heating system and hot water system. So you can see that the central purple block is gas central heating, and then of course we've got gas combi boilers, electric heating systems, oil-fired heating systems, etc. So here we've got a dotted line which represents the average energy use intensity across those different types of heating systems throughout the entire English housing stock. And here in blue and there in green, we've got what would happen if we had total substitution of the heating system. In the first case, it's for district heating, and in the second case, it's for ground source heat pumps. That was just to get a handle on what would happen if we had complete transformation towards, in this case, probably the best performing in terms of the seasonal coefficient of performance and how that translates, depending upon the carbon intensity of the power sector, to carbon emissions. And so here we can see that there's, well, here we're just looking at energy use intensity. So so the energy use intensity is halving if we have that total substitution. Okay, so a summary of these traditional housing stock energy models, where we're just modelling the housing stock as being a static entity. So we're saying, okay, well, we've had some survey data set supplied to us. In England, we've got the English Housing Survey. In Wales, you've got the Welsh Housing Condition Survey. We've used that data set to model the entire housing stock. So let's see how that energy is used in the stock, and how it could be, how that energy use intensity could be reduced. So we've seen that there are two main strategies. So these monthly energy balance models, but they're not able to predict internal temperatures. They're not able to predict what's going to happen, as a gentleman earlier said, if we're substituting a gas central heating system that has a high temperature hydraulic distribution network with a low temperature system. So if we're having a low temperature heat pump, then unless we're upgrading the fabric or changing the sizes of radiators, then comfort is going to be negatively impacted. Anyway, so BREEDM type models can't do that. Dynamic energy simulations can, but they've only just recently become available. The big drawback, of course, is that, well, the housing stock isn't static, is it? And we're looking at a time horizon between now and 2050 or beyond, okay? And the investments that are going to be needed are potentially going to mean that some investments are locking homes into substandard systems, or systems that have been invested in, for example, heating systems without upgrading the fabric. And some of those investments then are going to, homeowners are going to be saddled with those investments for many years into the future. Anyway, my point is that we want to understand a little bit better how the housing stock is likely to evolve between now and 2050 or beyond. We want to understand the extent to which there's going to be a demand for new construction, how properties are deteriorating and need to be perhaps demolished and reconstructed, the elements of the envelope that need to be replaced. So in the US, so this graph on the left, there was a guy called Daniel Muller who developed a model to account for this element of dynamics that relates to growth of population and how that changes the demand for housing, and also how elements of the envelope of buildings deteriorate, leading to component or whole building substitution. This was recently updated by a guy called Igor Sartori in Norway, who develops a similar kind of strategy to model the evolution of the housing stock in Norway and a bunch of other European countries, in fact, as well. to try to get a handle on the extent to which the embodied energy and embodied carbon content of housing in those countries would evolve between now and 2050. But of course that's missing the operational bit, so the energy use due to heating and hot water and lighting, etc., etc. So at around a similar time, then a couple of researchers from Iceland, Frazeli and Davidsdottir, developed what I think is a really interesting modelling strategy, which is now trying to model the kind of social processes that underpin decisions to renovate houses. So we renovate because, well, we're relocating and we've just bought a new house and we'd like to upgrade it. We're renovating because, well, the energy bills are too high. We're renovating because the indoor comfort conditions are too low. We have a number of drivers. There are social drivers to renovation, there are improvements in technology and regulatory interventions that cause us to require to renovate our homes. So they developed a system dynamics framework that enables them to handle those different drivers to the renovation decision-making process. And they've tested ways in which the stock in Iceland is likely to evolve over relatively long time periods in response to those underpinning drivers, and the extent to which those drivers can be manipulated to increase the rate of renovation. So to what extent can subsidies be made available? To what extent can professional expertise be made available to support the renovation process and accelerate the renovation process? And I think they have the foundations of a really interesting modelling approach here. So taking all of that kind of on board, then the report ultimately sets out two sets of recommendations. So recommendations in the short to medium term and recommendations in the longer term. So in the short to medium term, I think that it would be relatively straightforward for Wales to have a Welsh housing model using our energy hub or some other alternative, simply by processing the Welsh Housing Condition Survey data, and then test in a similar way to what we've done in England, to test a raft of decarbonisation scenarios and how they might target specific typologies of housing within Wales, potentially also in specific locations. But to add a little bit more power to that, then I've recommended enriching our archetyping framework to also account for the links between housing type, household composition, and household tenure. As we've seen earlier, there are big differences between owner-occupied, private rented, social rented. And spatial modelling, so that we can have a much finer-grained understanding of how energy use is distributed amongst the stock of houses in Wales, so that local authorities can make much more targeted interventions to raise the bar of houses within their jurisdictions. I talked a little bit about behavioural modelling, and I think it's also relatively straightforward to put together a web interface to crowdsource data to improve the fidelity of that kind of modelling strategy. And we're currently doing that in England as part of a Heat Pump Ready programme. And then finally is the longer term recommendations to enable us to try to forecast the change in population, changes in household relocation or household relocation decisions, and the extent to which over 5-year time increments houses deteriorate, and then components of the whole house needs to be replaced. Then I'd suggest that there should be fairly considerable investment in trying to get a much better handle on households' investment decisions, the factors that influence those investment decisions, so that much more targeted policies can be arrived at, so that we're switching now from looking at possible future outcomes to probable future outcomes, and the way in which those probable future outcomes can be so the likelihood, well, the rate at which those probable futures can be accelerated, if you like. And then we could also look at the extent to which future climate is going to lead to changes in excess summer and winter ill health outcomes, And then, of course, all of this would benefit from some scenario modelling and optimisation, so that we're able to provide much more targeted advice for where policy-related investments ought to be made to accelerate this decarbonisation process. That's it in a nutshell. Okay, thank you.
Fantastic, thank you. I've got 3 questions of my own, but I know we need to hold our questions, so we'll come straight to you, Jorian, and then John, and then there'll be time for questions and discussion after that.
So we can see you, Jérôme. Are you able to share your screen? I'm not sure which mic you can hear.
Yeah, looks.
Okay.
Yeah.
Can you share your screen, Jérôme?
Yep, I will start. Sorry, yeah, the sound from your end is quite bad, but I think we're going to manage. All good. So thanks for having me in this meeting today. I was already introduced indeed as a professor of public governance with a lot of experience in urban climate transition. So my interest is truly indeed in how can we come up with innovative policy models and regulatory interventions, but also more sort of voluntary approaches to change the behavior of people, households, and organizations. So I've been looking around the world at all sorts of novel innovations, new models for policy making in this space. And I think the talk today, sort of talking about carbon modeling, is really essential for what I think are going to be future policy models in this space. So most of you, of course, are aware that the conventional approach to policy making in household carbon emissions, but in the building sector more general, is that we tend to work with one-size-fits-all policies. We tend to work with sort of one-size-fits-all building codes and building regulation, in which even existing buildings are very often exempted from compliance with alterations and amendments. So that's sort of one of the major problems I think that we face currently in the transition towards a carbon neutral society, that we tend to look at the building stock as just being sort of one thing that we address in one way. I think another thing is that construction policy or building policy very often follows technological developments rather than that policy developments are ahead of them. So policy developments very often are only introduced once a new technology has been established. And I think sort of a third problem, and the previous presentation also touched on that a little bit already, is that we tend to look in housing, construction, and building policy at regulating or putting expectations on objects, on the houses themselves, rather than on the way that people are using their homes. And therefore, we very often see that objectives, good intentions of policy interventions are not being met. And I would argue, and I think that it really nicely builds on the previous presentation, is that the building stock, the housing stock, is not one size. We have different types of buildings from different eras. Uses are also sort of not one size. We have different types of uses. So we really need to embrace, I think, that variety in the housing stock and its uses if we want to come up with policy approaches that can truly help us to become more carbon neutral, by 2050 and ideally a bit earlier. So what I've been looking around at the world is how can we make that transition from those one-size-fits-all policy models to more dynamic, more tailored policy approaches and interventions. There are various ways of thinking about it, and I only have time to show you one of them. But one of them would be to sort of think about your policy model following what is known as diffusion of innovations, sort of where you would say, okay, we know that people have to improve their behavior in their houses, or we know that houses need to be, become better insulated or be retrofitted. So rather than thinking about everybody must do it in sort of the same kind of way, why don't we think about the uptake of the housing stock, sort of the market that the housing stock is, as an area where we see people who already know it, sort of the early movers, people who are very keen, and organizations that are very keen to do better. And then sort of on the other end of the spectrum, we have the laggards, people who cry wolf with every sort of regulatory improvement that you're going to implement, saying that it is going to be impossible, that it cannot be done. So that's sort of the end of the spectrum. And then sort of in the middle, we have that big group of people that are probably interested in doing better. They just don't know how to do it, or they don't really care yet, or they don't see a personal incentive sort of in how to do it. And if you look at policy innovations around the world, you could actually say, why don't we begin targeting these different groups with different policy instruments, so that eventually everybody is going to live in better houses? So you could think about the early movers, people who are already keen to make a change, to introduce voluntary programs, to really incentivize these people and work with them very closely to think about what are the opportunities and what are the constraints for property owners and property users in retrofitting. What can be done? So an example, for instance, comes from the city of Sydney, that has launched the Better Buildings Partnership. And the city of Sydney at some point realized that if the city wants to become carbon neutral, and we're talking about a city of over 5 million people, so if they want to become carbon neutral, they indeed also need to cut carbon emissions of the building stock. About 50% of the city's emissions come from the building stock. So what the City of Sydney government has done is partner up with the major property owners, so a number of large property owners, and ask them, why are you not retrofitting their buildings? Why are you not retrofitting your buildings? And then the reply was, well, because we face all kinds of regulatory constraints. And then the City of Sydney realized that by partnering with building owners, by understanding what are the problems that you are facing, we can come up with all kinds of innovative approaches to reduce carbon emissions of the building stock. And the interesting thing is, if you sort of look at these voluntary programs, because we see these sorts of things all around the world, is that they very often build on a leadership narrative. Sort of, you really stress that people are ahead of the curve, and you give them leadership rewards by telling how great they are doing if you have your next policy meeting. So to really stress that these people are leading. But the great thing about it is that you can then try to use the stuff that works really well in these voluntary programs to make the majority change their attitude and their behavior. Because the majority is probably not all too keen to do it all for free, or they don't want to be sort of seen as leaders, or they might not even care to be seen as leaders, but they do care about, their homes, and they do care about how much they spend on energy. So perhaps you can meet that majority sort of in the middle with nudges and performance-based incentives. So for instance, you could try to think about how can we help that majority, that middle group, the people that are probably okay with making a change but not knowing how to do it. How can we, for instance, help them to, improve their buildings and get a better BREEAM rating? Are there any subsidies that we can think about? Or something very simple, how about we use sort of nudges and tell homeowners, well, this is how your house is performing compared to the other houses in your neighborhood. And actually, you're not performing all too well. Or you can tell them, well, you are actually performing really well. But if you would do these sorts of things, then you could actually cut your costs for heating a little bit more. So that middle group, I think, needs to be targeted with these sorts of nudges and performance-based incentives that really build on a personal gain narrative, sort of what is in it for the individual themselves, and really reward them. And then you could again use sort of the knowledge and the information that you get out of those practices and those policy models to really push the laggards forwards. So the legates, would be the people who would not move by themselves. They would not be interested in any positive incentives. They would only move ahead if you increase standards and regulation. Now, what normally happens if you do that is indeed, like I said already, that these people and these organizations begin sort of crying wolf, this cannot be done. But if you would go through a dynamic policy regime as the one that I'm sort of outlining here, you could tell those legates, well, actually, the new standards that we are introducing and the new policy tools that we are introducing have already been tested in the field by those early movers in the voluntary programs. And then we sort of, pick we then sort of cherry pick the best ideas and, have introduced that. And actually a large number of people have already improved their buildings. And now it is truly time for you to do it. So you would, at the end of the day, need to increase your building codes. And then you could sort of work with these people by telling, well, actually, we using your homes in a different way and retrofitting your homes really has become the social norm over the last 10, 20 years, because we're talking 2050 now. But you would need the force of law. Now, of course, this looks fantastic in theory, sort of the model that I'm laying out here, but to understand if it works and where are your early movers and where is your majority and where are your legates and what sort of policy interventions work or not. For that, you need good data. And I think that the models, the carbon modeling models that were just discussed, give you a bit of an idea how, on the one hand, better carbon modeling could help you to produce these sort of long-term dynamic policy visions, and then how you can use carbon modeling and all the data that you get out of that sort of to keep a finger at the pulse of, is the idea that we have, are the policy models that we have, are they truly working? And I really like that line that we very quickly saw on one of the previous slides, is sort of to use that new WHM, new carbon modeling model, to test a palette of decarbonization scenarios, because that's actually what I'm trying to say that you can do from a policy point of view. You could introduce a palette of policy interventions that target early movers, majority, and legates, and then use the carbon modeling information to see which of these policy programs truly work and when you can lift good ideas from the early movers to the majority and sort of the good ideas from the majority to the legates. So in that kind of way, you get a really nice synthesis between the modeling, your policy models, the implementation, and learning if things work, yes or no. I'm going to leave it with that, and I'm happy to answer any questions that might have come up.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. We could hear you really well, even if you can't hear us so well. And we will come back with questions in a bit. So dynamic modelling, dynamic regulatory regimes. John.
And then it all stops at policy, right?
Dynamic policy.
Dynamic policy. Thanks, Steve. I'm a civil servant. I work in the Welsh Government, and at the moment I lead the division looking at climate change and domestic energy efficiency. And I'm not a modeller, so I'm not going to try and trample over Jerome and Darren's expertise, because I'm going to look quite foolish. So I'm not an analyst. I was a quarter of a century ago, but I can't claim to be an analyst any longer. I'm not an economist. I'm not a statistician. There's a joke in there somewhere about I have a personality or something like that, but I'm a civil servant, so clearly I don't. So what I'm going to talk about is what it feels like, I suppose, from a policy delivery perspective, being a keen amateur, trying to discuss policy needs and policy aims and objectives with people who generate models and trying to translate that back into policy and some of the challenges that we face there. So most of my time when it comes to models is about macro climate models. It's about numbers, it's about big change, it's about key points in time where something changes and trying to anticipate where that would be and and what policy will be required to generate that change, and what policy is required to mitigate the impacts of that change in certain areas as well. So the only reason I'm interested in models is because of policy. That's the only reason. I'm a bit of a wonk, but I'm not that wonkish that I'm interested in models on the weekend. I'm only interested in models when it can help me deliver policy. So from a top-down climate perspective, we are trying to, for example, in the industrial sector in Wales, trying to understand what are those big changes. We know that hydrogen is in the mix. We know that electrification is in the mix. We know that carbon capture and storage is in the mix, or carbon capture and usage is in the mix. What we're trying to understand is, within a landscape of an economy that's challenging to predict, within investment decisions that are not necessarily what I would perceive to be standard rational policy or investment decisions, because just because there's a payback of 5 years doesn't mean to say that investment is made. What policies are required to either encourage, cajole, inform, force those investment decisions so that decarbonisation can happen? And of course, what complicates matters is that I'm not just interested in carbon. We can decarbonise Wales in any number of different ways that cause serious harms to people in Wales. And we'd like to try and avoid that. What we are really interested in is the economy. Are we able to protect existing jobs? When I say protect existing jobs, what I mean is, are we able to transition those jobs to do the same thing in a low carbon way? Are we able to create new jobs? Are we able to incentivize new business models that are going to be required? So I think a lot of the discussion that I've been involved in decarbonisation of housing policy is how, and there was a comment there from Jerome about policy only happens when technology is established, and then the policy kind of trots on behind, my words, not yours, trots on behind afterwards. But are we able to make decisions that inform new business models that can deliver outcomes of carbon, employment, and also social benefit? There is a wonderful opportunity to increase social cohesion, increase social benefit, increase fairness in our in the way that we live in our homes. But if we just think about carbon, we won't see those opportunities and we won't deliver them. Actually, there's cultural aspects in Wales, particularly actually in Wales, I think. When I first got involved in trying to understand I'm an Englishman. When I first got involved in trying to understand the culture of Wales was when I first came here as a student, and I thought it was British. And then within a week or so, I realised that I was English. A couple of decades later, I found some interesting research into how people feel about their Welshness. And I kind of thought that Shane Williams running underneath the posts, again, with English shirts trailing behind, was how he got Welsh people excited, because that's what I'd seen in the pub. But apparently it isn't. It's about landscape. It's about language. So there are cultural aspects we're trying to protect and support in our decarbonisation journey. And of course, there are environmental things that we're trying to affect as well. So in agriculture, in Wales, we will not achieve our nature objectives if we just carpet Wales in trees. We won't do it. We have to land share, not land spare. And all of that has to come together in one big decarbonisation model that allows policies to fit underneath it. And that is enormously challenging. And when you fit those policies underneath it, what you hope is that the carbon impact assessments and all the social and economic impact assessments that you do of those policies add up to that pathway, and they never will. Because there's things in between the top down and the bottom up, that you have no control of and no sight of. And it's very, very difficult to anticipate. So from a major climate perspective, I'm interested in the top down and the bottom up, and how they meet, but I know that they will never meet. So we are doing a lot of top-down climate modelling currently in Welsh Government. In certain areas, we can see very, very clear pathways for decarbonisation. 40% of our emissions comes from 6 sites, 6 industrial sites. That's a lot easier than 1.4 million homes with I don't know how many families in those homes, let's say 500,000 families in those homes, behaving in 500,000 different ways, with a high proportion of stock pre-1919, and from our fuel poverty schemes, we know that if you have a row of pre-1919 homes, and there are 100 of them, they're lived in 101 different ways, and they've all been changed in 102 different ways. They're all heated in different ways. They've all got different thermal properties, etc. So I've been drawn by a couple of the things that I've heard today, which resonate with me a lot. And part of it is about things not remaining the same. So the Energy System Catapult did quite a lot of good work in Bridgend a number of years ago in the Smart Systems and Heat programme. And what they clearly said is it's going to, their models suggested £8.5 billion to decarbonise every building in the Bridgend County Borough Council, which by any standard is quite a lot of money. But £7 billion was going to get spent anyway. And that was on new doors, new heating systems, and new windows, and things were just going to happen to those homes anyway. So homes not staying the same, I think, was a key thing that I've lived through some of that learning. The point about population and relocation and deterioration as well. Not only do the homes not stay the same, how they're lived in doesn't stay the same. And the point about one size not fitting all, well, if you've got 101 different homes in 100, then that's something that we've lived through. And behaviour being a big aspect of that as well. So I'm keen for the conversation to continue and not ramble too much more about things that aren't really related to the modelling of housing. But I'm just trying to express, I suppose, from a policy-making perspective, the models that we're talking about here are absolutely essential for developing informed a policy that meets a whole range of objectives, not just decarbonisation.
Great. Thank you very much. So I promised some time for questions, and our 3 speakers have very skillfully enabled us to have time. Thank you. We've got about 10 minutes. And I need to speak up. Please.
I have been intrigued very much from your talk right now, because I was thinking that we try to decarbonize whatever the cost. And you mentioned that we try to decarbonize, but we may do it in very bad ways. And I totally get what you mean. Is it a class of prioritization then? Is my first question. The other is, I'm trying to bring in the discussion here some best practices. I'm a Greek living in Wales for the 8th year now with my family. I used to live in a flat in Cardiff Bay, and I used to pay much less for heating, so also emit much less compared to Greece with its sunny weather. I now live in a traditional British house, and I hate it because it's bloody frozen, and I emit much more. What has been done years ago is that the ball has been thrown to utilities with appropriate legislation, and those utilities have been transferred from energy traders to energy services companies. And basically they have a mandate to go to each home. They provide energy, they audit, they make a list of what needs to happen, they finance it, and they charge a bit higher prices per unit, but overall lower units of energy are consumed, lower emissions are produced. This seems like a policy that has been tried in California, in Sacramento years ago. It was successful. The Welsh government is not expected to finance all this, but can legislate, can see things to affect more decarbonization. So I just want to ask the first question and bring this into the discussion now.
Thank you very much. A couple of other questions. Yeah. No. Okay. Did you hear the question, John?
The
I am speaking to the mic. No. Yeah. Okay. Let's take a couple more questions, and I'll try and summarise them, please.
Gary Rawlings, Untitled Limited. The policy in Wales and in England on building houses. I was at a farming get-together in the middle of Wales last year, and I'll be very, very quick with this. And one thing that came out was energy for houses. Now, both in Wales and in England, we have mines, pits. And in every pit, there's a shaft. And when you go down to that shaft, there's hot water can come out and power. 1 month later, after I brought this up, I think they're doing something down in Tamswell, down in the Swansea area as well. Isn't there some sort of plan for communities to be brought in around those areas where we used to have the coal mines? And it would be a fantastic legacy. And my other part of the question is wood-burning stoves. This is something that's, we are taking the wood from natural wood, even pellets and so on and so forth, and I feel that there's going to be a big problem in a couple of years' time. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. John, would you like to go first? And could you, for the benefit of your own, just repeat roughly which of those questions you're addressing? Would that be okay? And then I'll come to you, Darren, and then we'll go to Jerome.
Yeah, I don't know if others have a favoured question to answer. I was
Take
just going to
whatever you
start.
want,
I was just going to start
yeah.
at the start, really, and that was twofold, really. One, it was about, inverted commas, bad decarbonisation or harmful decarbonisation, and one was about essentially energy as a service. We can decarbonise in any number of different ways, and that's the challenge of policymakers. How do we do that in ways that not only meet the carbon targets, but do so in a way that, for want of a better expression, it has climate justice at its heart and creates opportunity where perhaps there hasn't previously been. Just to put it in context here, there is opportunity. The fossil fuel system that we have currently in the UK Wales currently exports 10 to 15% of its GVA every single year just by paying its energy bill. By filling the car, by turning on the lights, and by heating our home, 10 to 15% of the entire GVA of Wales leaves, never to be seen again. Some of it goes to the Treasury, and if the Chancellor's feeling generous, we might get some of that back. But lots of it goes to the fossil fuel system. So there are significant opportunities economically in Wales for just moving away from that kind of system to one where we don't have to pay that tariff. So that's the art of what we're trying to do as policymakers. You talked about energy as a service, from what I think I heard from you, which is that idea, I suppose, that you have a financier and an energy company and an implementer who join forces, who knock on the door and say, John, you're currently paying £100 for your energy needs. We will supply it for £95 if you sign up to us for index-linked, but if you sign up to us for the next 25 years. What they do is then they come and make my home more energy efficient, and then I pay for those works essentially over the next 25 years. That requires fundamental market reform and requires all of those counterparties that already exist. Skills is low, the skills base is low, but the money is there, the energy companies are there, but the incentives need to come to force that to happen. And I think for somebody like me, who frankly probably has a bill of about £25,000, I would suggest, to get my house, which is also horrible, like your own, to get that energy efficient, then that's how I want to pay for it. I want to pay for it over 25 years, and I want the charge to be on the home. If I sell my home, I don't want to take that debt with me. I want that debt to remain with the home so that it goes to the new owner.
Great. Thank you. Darren.
So just to respond to that, I think one of the challenges is that we do have a lot of volatility in the housing market, and I think maybe there's a degree of nervousness about whether or not people are comfortable passing on that debt, whether there are going to be buyers that are comfortable taking it on. The other thing is that the Green Deal that was tried in England or the UK didn't work. It was a complete disaster because the interest rates that were being charged were too high, and they were above mortgage rates. I mean, so it was a bit of a rip-off. So it failed really badly. But the principle, I agree, is very interesting and has a lot of merit if it's implemented in an effective manner. The other thing that I would say is that we have a very heterogeneous stock of houses occupied by a very heterogeneous stock of households, if you like. And even within a single house, and we were talking earlier about a very drafty Victorian house that I lived in not too long ago. Even that was spatially heterogeneous in terms of, we were being frugal and heating only the bits that we were occupying when we occupied them to the minimum level that we were comfortable with. So it's a complex beast. To come to the point about using mines, then this is something that's being looked at in South Yorkshire, where I broadly am living at the moment, and I'm sure it's been looked at elsewhere. There's a lot of potential for using geothermal energy in that respect. Personally, I like wood fuel boilers, or burners rather, so long as they're sustainably supplied and suitably maintained to make sure that the indoor air quality is of an adequate level. But that's a personal view.
Yeah.
I'll make a prediction. Within 5 years, you'll be burning coconuts.
Okay, thank you. Jeroen, anything that you want to add to that?
Look, I see that we're pretty much at time. So perhaps one of the things that I hear being sort of said in the previous comments is that, there's a lot of heterogeneity, and I think we sometimes worry too much about it and see it as a problem rather than a strength. So there are a lot of examples out there how different types of homes and how different types of households have been incentivized with different sorts of policy models. And I really think that if we truly step away from trying to target everybody with the same sort of tool and say, like, look, it is a heterogeneous market out there, so we need a variety of tools that we can truly make that shift from seeing heterogeneity as a problem to seeing it as a strength. But I'm going to leave it with that because we are at your 4 p.m.
Yeah, great. Thank you very much. Let's thank all three speakers again. Fantastic contributions. Thank you very much. I think what we've heard is that there's complexity, there are multiple policy objectives and a good degree of uncertainty about how they interact and how they might work in the future, but that we have some tools at our disposal, both in terms of our understanding behaviour change, the adoption of innovations, targeting different sections of the population, and being very much more sophisticated in the way that we think about the housing stock and the implications, therefore, of energy modelling. So thank you very much for a really fascinating session. Thank you for your questions.
Thank you.
We're due downstairs in the next 5 to 10 minutes to hear Rowan Williams give our keynote speech, and then please do stay for the drinks reception after that. Thanks again.